I want you to rock the fort trick. Hi, welcome to my video. I'm National Master James Richardson, and today I'd like to show you the fort trick in the Italian Four Knights. This is a very common opening in my experience at scholastic level, especially for under 1200 players. The fort trick occurs after a very natural sequence of moves, where both players put their knights on f3, f6, c3, c6, and then the bishop comes out. And what often happens is the players copy each other and the position gets very locked up. But today we're going to look at a tactic that breaks the symmetry and allows black to fight for the initiative. This is an exciting opening, and it actually can get very complicated, even though it may be regarded as a beginner's opening. It wasn't a while till masters discovered this move, and the variation fell out of practice for white. So first we're going to start with the most common mistakes. And in this video, I'm going to introduce you the typical move orders that can occur, and also one of the most common mistakes I see, especially at 1000 level. Okay, so I'm going to show this over an actual board, and I want to recreate the feel of a private lesson where I would be showing you the moves over the board and describing my thoughts. And what I'll do is ask you questions at various points in the video in interesting positions that prompt you to think about the position. And I encourage you to pause the video and think about them yourself, because this is the best way to improve. Okay, so let's rock the fort trick and go. The Four Knights Italian starts from this position and can be reached by two move orders. Let's see. First, it can start from the Four Knights game, which starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, and now bishop c4. More popular for white these days is bishop b5, which is the Spanish Four Knights, and also d4, which is the Scotch Four Knights. Another move order to reach the Italian Four Knights is from the Italian, which starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and now instead of knight c3, bishop c4. In here, if black plays the two knights defense and white defends the pawn with knight c3, we reach the same position. I'll mention that it's probably better for white to defend with d3. And there are also some active options with d4 and knight g5. But if he's aiming for solidity, I would recommend d3. Knight c3 here is very common at under 1200 level, especially in scholastic chess. And I think a common reason for this is that this is a natural developing move that defends the pawn and also controls d5. So you have three pieces controlling this square. For instance, if white played d3, black could have the option of playing d5 here, although that's very risky for him to do so. But the reason that you don't see this position much in master play is a very nice tactic called the fort trick. Before this was discovered, most often you would see bishop c5, and you'd reach a position like this, d3, d6, and the best move for white is probably bishop g5, which is often called the canal attack in the Giacco Pianissimo. And this is a very safe variation for white to play. And it can be hard for black to play for a win here if white knows what he's doing. So that can tend to be rather locked up. The variation we'll see today opens up the game. and black plays knight takes e4. And the idea of this move is if white takes back, or if white takes the knight, black can gain the piece back with a pawn fork, starting with d5, attacking both the knight and the bishop. Now, before I cover this today, I want to mention in passing that white has two other options after knight takes e4. White could play bishop takes f7, and this is a tricky line that you often see in blitz, but it's actually quite dubious, and black can play for a clear advantage if he knows how to defend properly. Another move you can encounter is castles, and this is called the Boden-Kieseritzky gambit. And this is quite tricky too, and has an even better reputation. And you need to know how to defend accurately here as well. These I cover in separate videos, and I'll put links in the video description. But today we're going to cover the most important move, knight takes e4. After white takes the knight and black forks the knight and the bishop, white has three main moves he can consider here. Only one is good though. The main move is bishop d3, and that will be our main coverage. But there are also a couple of sidelines. If you're under 1,000, you're likely to encounter these. The first one is bishop takes d5, and the other is bishop to b5. One thing I'll mention in passing is that if white doesn't do any of these moves, then he just loses material. For instance, if he plays bishop b3, this is a blunder because black can just take the knight, and white doesn't even get his pawn. So black's up to pawn up, and this knight has nowhere to go except backwards. Note that he cannot go to g5 because the queen can take it and it's not protected. So that's something white should definitely avoid. The first move we'll look at here is bishop takes d5. And when I show this position to younger students at schools, usually this is the first move that's suggested. And it's quite natural, seeing that you're going to lose a piece, to try to get the pawn back immediately. But it's the wrong way to give back the piece, because black can take back the bishop, and here black has the bishop pair, which is often an advantage in open games. In this open position, the bishops work very well together, controlling squares of opposite color. And here, white's knight's under attack. Black has a strong central presence also, okay? And he's better developed, as you can see. So white has to deal with the knight here, and there are two moves to consider. The first one we'll look at is d3, and the other one is knight c3. So let's first look at d3, protecting the knight. This also opens the bishop. Here, black can exploit the absence of the light square bishop and pin the knight with bishop g4. And this is a strong pin because white doesn't have his bishop to guard here. And this is very difficult to deal with because black has ways to put pressure on the piece, like knight d4. And another thing too is black is already ready to castle on the queen side. And this can be very effective in attacking the king if he castles on the king side, because black is free to launch forward in the attack. So here, there are a few moves we could consider. Our main line will be h3, but I'll mention that if black plays knight c3 to attack the queen now, we can just pin it and develop. And if white tries to get out of the pin, well, we can just keep developing quickly. Just take the knight and castle queenside. And here we have a battery on the d file. This helps our central control. And if white castles kingside, we can keep putting on more pressure with f5. And already black is starting to get some strong threats, like e4 is a move that comes into consideration soon. So that's very pleasant for black. Let's look at another move. Okay, let's have the bishop here. Another move that white could consider is bishop to g5. And this prevents black from castling queenside at the moment. And this also sets up a little trap. It might be tempting to block the diagonal with f6 and attack the bishop so you can castle the next move. But this move is a blunder. Pause the video for a moment to see if you can find the move for white. Okay, did you see it? It's bishop takes f6. And you see that if the pawn recaptures, then we have the fork of the king and the queen. Also the bishop, but that's the main thing. So here, black needs to find something else, clearly. You have a good alternative, though. Instead of chasing the bishop, you can start with the knight. Push the knight back first. Then there won't be any tactics like that. The knight can come back and attack the queen. But again, with d3 here, you can pin it. And there may not be anything better than white to retreat. And then we could play the same plan. And again, very active game. And another thing is we also have an alternate retreat. We can go back with the queen and chase back the bishop and castle queenside. And that's also good. So black gets a good game there as well. Okay, so let's look at h3, trying to break the pin. We can go back. If white castles, we can castle queenside ourselves. Okay. And we can go for the f5 plan again. That's usually pretty strong. Let's say white tries to break the pin immediately with g4. Okay, he's broken the pin, but he's also weakened his king side. And there's not really a clear place for the king to go. All we do is we just retreat. And we threaten the knight at the same time. Here white can defend with queen e2, but black has a strong move that you can play immediately to exploit the weakness created by g4. So this is a good moment to think, so I recommend that you pause the video and think about what you could do to really put the pressure on white here. Okay, so there's natural moves like castling queenside, but you can actually strike right away with h5. And this is an effective way to attack this position, this pawn weakness. And here, white has a rather unpleasant choice. If he takes the pawn, the bishop takes back, and then we have the pin again. And furthermore, the knight's been weakened because he's lost his support of the pawn. That's the thing about pawn moves. You can't move pawns backwards. So that doesn't work out so well. Another thing is black himself is threatening to take on g4 because the rook's undefended. If black protects the pawn with the rook to gather the pin, takes, well, black has an open file, and this is rather awkward. And lastly, if white pushes the pawn to g5, again, black can renew the possibility of a pin with h4. And this frees the square for the bishop. It also cuts out potential support of the pawn here, but the main thing is right away you renew this, the idea of this pin, and on top of this, he can't even move his knight here to control that square. So this is great for black. And he's ready to play bishop h5 and castle queenside with an excellent position. Okay. So this works out pretty favorably for black after d3. So we've seen a lot of the main ideas. Let's look at another move. Okay, so after bishop takes pawn, queen takes. Knight has to make you have to make a decision about how to hold the knight. White can also play knight c3, attacking the queen. And here there's no pin with bishop b5 like we had after d3. So we need to retreat the queen and find a good square for it. A good square is queen to d6. And here the queen keeps control on the d file, which restrains white's center. And also, the queen has additional options of swinging over to the king side to attack. And white has to make a decision here. Okay, so white can castle king side here. But again, we have the pin. And we're ready to castle queen side. So White's already under significant pressure. For instance, if white tries to develop with d3, knight d4 puts a lot of pressure on the knight, and already it's too late for white to try to break the pin even, because after h3, black could ruin his kingside structure, he'd lose a pawn. And if he tried to save the exchange here, he'd get mated. Okay, so white has to do something about that. White can put the rook on the e file to attempt some counterplay on the file. And here again, black can play knight d4, but a rather calm way of handling this is just to continue with the development and keep the pressure on and play queenside castles. Okay, white can play h3, try to break the pin. You would just retreat again. We don't want to give this up. We don't want to take the knight. We want to keep the pressure on. Okay. White can continue developing with d3, and black can continue with f5. Here, let's give white a developing move. Bishop e3, natural. We can still continue our development, develop our final piece with bishop e7. And let's say white tries to get something started on the queen side. Maybe push his pawn over here with a4. Now we can already go for an attack that we're fully developed. And a good move is queen to g6. We're all ready for this move. Now we have two pins. Okay, so the queen is firing at the king, but also we've opened up the line for the rook opposite the queen, which means this pawn's pinned. And combined with the pin on this knight, the threat of e4 is very powerful. Now let's say white tries to defend against that with bishop d2 to break the pin along the d file and get extra coverage of e4. Black has a very strong move that gives him a winning advantage. So pause the video and think how you continued here. Okay, so a good solution for black here is to push the pawn anyway. And the idea here is after the pawn takes, not to take the pawn, but we have another move. And if this wasn't your move, try to stop the video now and think about what you do. There's a nice tactic here. Okay, you can play rook takes d2. And there's not a good way to capture the rook. If the knight takes, well, you take his queen because the knight's pinned. If the queen takes, the knight's no longer supported. We have a third pin. This pawn is pinned, and we can just take the bishop threatening mate. And then once he protects against mate, we have two bishops for a rook and a winning advantage. So let's go back. Let's see. So after rook takes bishop, one thing I also want to mention is that the intermediate move, pawn takes pawn, another move you can consider, doesn't work out either because after you can just take the queen and then trade off the rooks. Trade, and then you're up a piece because you got here on d2. So let's go back to our position. In fact, let's start from our starting position with the fort trick and review the moves. Knight takes pawn. Whoops, okay. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes knight. Fork the knight and bishop. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes bishop. And then we're looking at knight c3. We have our retreat, queen d3. And then if he castles, we play bishop g4. And one thing I'll mention is, okay, we looked at h3 and d3. Another thing is if the knight goes here, we can often go to g6 like we saw earlier, okay, and prepare f5 with a strong attack as well. But a question to ask here is, what if white tries to prevent the pin ahead of time with h3? He can do this. And we can continue developing. We can put the bishop on f5 to prepare castling queenside. But we have an even more incisive option. We can play queen to g6 and force white to immediately deal with the threat to g2. This is actually quite awkward because castling is dangerous because this pawn's pinned again. Bishop h3 is a big problem. And probably white's best move here is to play knight b5. Okay, and here taking on g2 would be a mistake because although we're attacking the rook, he gets a tempo with rook g1, and then he can take on c7 on the next move. However, we have a calm way to defend and continue our development. We can just play bishop d6. And here white can take the bishop. We can just take back with the pawn, keep our queen in this position, and white still has to deal with the threat. So since castling doesn't work because of bishop h3, he can play king to f1, but e4 is very annoying. Okay, where does the knight go? Not a great position for him. Okay, his king's awkward position, his knight's going to be in awkward position, black has the center, and he's ready to castle next move. For instance, if he goes back, you can just castle, you have a great game. Suppose white plays d3 to control e4. Well, then you can just take the pawn. And white can attack you back, but you can just take the other pawn. And although white gets g7, white's king is weaker, and he's up material. In fact, white can win with bishop to g4. Now white has an in-between move. He can play rook g3 first and drive the queen back. For instance, f5 is a good square, and then take the pawn. Now this is a better result for him. He's still a pawn down. Black can just develop and castle queenside. So this is bad for white as well. So giving up the g pawn doesn't work out so well for him. Let's examine for a moment g3. Okay, this is pretty weakening as well. Maybe the best white can hope for is to walk the king to g2, okay, and eventually get his rook out. But this has a tactical flaw. Black can play queen to e4 check, and the knight is loose. If the queen blocks, he'd like to trade queens, but this would drop a pawn. So if he wants to hold on the material, he can play king f1, but that doesn't work so well for him either, because black has a nasty pin on this knight because this rook's unprotected, and black can put pressure on the pin piece, and the only way to defend it, king g2, puts him in another pin, where the target's the king now. And black just needs to get another piece on this diagonal, and white's position will crack. A good way to do this is b6. Okay, you can get the bishop over on b7. White's kind of in an awkward position. Okay, he can attack the queen with tempo and maybe defend his piece with rook e3. Oh, it's a little awkward. Maybe he can survive a little longer, but black has a very strong move here. He can just play queen to c6, keeping the pin, and also hitting c2. Each move comes with a threat. If white tries to save this pawn with c3, black has a winning move here, a little winning sequence. So here's another problem for you. I recommend you pause the video here and try to find a winning continuation for black. Okay, so simplest is just to take the knight. And this is not just an exchange. Okay, you have a deflection here. Bishop takes h3, winning the queen. If he takes the bishop, the queen is lost, and any other king move loses as well. So, all around, white's in a very uncomfortable position in this line.